The New World is a couple of massive continents now called North and South America. With a bit over 28% of the Earth's landmass, it is much smaller than the Old World. When Columbus first arrived, there were probably about 100 million inhabitants. A large chain of mountains runs down the west coast. The eastern parts are flatter and have large river basins like the Mississippi and Amazon. The continents extend some 8,700 miles north to south, meaning climate and ecology vary, a disadvantage for expanding food and trade across cultures. There are now 35 countries and a little over 1 billion people. Amerigo Vespucci called it Mundus Novus, Latin for New World, and got the continents named after him. Mercator used the name for his 16th century maps. Columbus continued to think he was in Asia. The indigenous people were first called Indians by Columbus, who remained confused about where he was, but the name stuck. The first mystery was, when did these people arrive? This proved to be a difficult and contentious issue. Archaeological sites were found throughout North and South America with surprising estimated dates and disagreements about the dating and interpretation of the results. Sometime between 40 and 17,000 years ago, they crossed into Alaska, probably in several waves. Some may have traveled by boat down the west coast as far as South America. Who were the people and why did they come to the New World? Not surprisingly, the indigenous peoples are genetically similar to southern Siberians. They were hunter-gatherers and probably followed the now extinct animals they hunted. There were over 1,000 indigenous languages in the Americas, grouped into about 100 language groups. This complicates understanding migration patterns, but suggests multiple migrations. Much of what we know about pre-European civilization comes from the biased accounts of the Europeans. Anthropologists, archaeologists, and others continued to provide a more complete picture. A useful source is Charles Mann's 1491, An Empathetic Look at Indigenous Cultures Before Columbus. Prosperity centered on sustainable agriculture. Throughout North America, the three sisters of corn, beans, and squash were central to success. The Peruvians developed potatoes as a sustainable crop that could be grown in the Andes. The Great Plains were filled with millions of bison, and the Plains Indians specialized in the nomadic life of bison hunting. The cliff dwellers of the desert Southwest built stone castles in the mountain cliffs. Sustainability required rain, and drought meant at least temporary failures. The Amazon had its own cultures, quite different from the others. They literally had to create their own soil and fields for viable farming. The major civilizations discovered by the early Spaniards were the Aztecs of Mesoamerica and the Inca of Peru. However, there were several advanced civilizations that existed before Europeans arrived. The Olmecs were the first major civilization in Mesoamerica, beginning about 1600 BCE in what is now Veracruz and Tabasco, creating large-scale farming. They produced the giant heads, possibly of recently deceased kings, as well as monumental buildings and pyramids, plus hieroglyphic writing. The population collapsed about 400 BCE, probably from ecological causes. They were followed by the Mayans, Toltecs, and others, all with similar competitive civilizations. Both trade and violence were part of these cultures. The Maya settled in the Yucatan Peninsula in southeastern Mexico, well into Central America. Agriculture was developed in the Archaic period before 2000 BCE, with staple crops of corn, beans, squash, and chilies. When the groundwater was undrinkable, the Maya laid crushed limestone over sediment, effectively paving over salt and hostile chemicals. Then they established their farms. They also carved out rain-retaining terraces on hillsides. Several Mesoamerican staples like cocoa and avocados might have originated in Mayan territory. The Mayans may have first created guacamole, tortillas, and tamales. They built cities with impressive temples by 500 BCE and developed hieroglyphic writing sometime after that. Tikal was on the trade routes and focused on trade rather than large-scale farming. The Classic period started about 250 CE with many city-states and complex trade networks. Political collapse of city-states happened in the 9th century. They recorded their histories on stelas, but most were destroyed by the Spanish. Without draft animals, much of the trade was done over water, including as far as the Caribbean. Trade was probably controlled by the elites, with merchants operating through port cities or inland trade centers. Ocean-going boats may have used sails, which are pictured on walls and pottery. Reports of 16th century Spanish encounters recorded as many as 25 to 50 Indians in larger boats. Salt seemed to have been central to trade, with salt workshops boiling brine in ceramic pots. Also traded were foodstuffs, textiles, tools, obsidian, precious metals, jewels, and ceramics. Tenochtitlan, roughly today's Mexico City, started in the 14th century, built on islands. It became the capital of the Aztecs in the 15th century and the largest city in the New World. The Aztec Empire was a confederation of 3 city-states in central Mexico, with the Mexica the dominant group. The Mexica were latecomers, building their states on poor islets in Lake Texcoco, creating a sophisticated farming culture using irrigation and artificial islands capable of year-round cultivation. Neighbors became client states through conquests and marriages, with considerable Aztec success south as far as Guatemala. Their militant religion included human sacrifice, with prisoners not appreciating the ceremonies. It shocked the conquering Spaniards. The last emperor was Montezuma, reigning from about 1502, dying while Cortez's prisoner in 1520. Advanced civilization started on the Peruvian coast before Mesoamerica, suggesting the possibility that they traveled down the Pacific coast by boat. Wakana, the oldest city, dated back 5,500 years, with temples and large public buildings within a few centuries. Populations likely summered in the foothills of the Andes and wintered by the coast, developing agriculture on relatively barren land. This required extensive irrigation and a widespread trade system. Multiple city-states were formed around Lake Titicaca between Peru and Bolivia, with Tiwanaku the religious center. The city's population was estimated at over 100,000. Advanced agriculture included terraced fields around the hills and extensive irrigation. It was a religious and trade center controlled by the elites. The militaristic Wari were defeated by the Inca in the 15th century, not long before Pizarro invaded. The Inca Empire ran from parts of Colombia through much of Chile. The key was the extensive trade system from the coast of Peru into the Andes, with varying foods from Pacific seafood to potatoes from the Andes. It was controlled from the center without markets or money. The shocking idea that people did what they were told. The Inca had metallurgy, but they mainly used gold and silver for art and decoration. Most tools were made of fiber rather than metal. Boats were woven from reeds, armor from quilted cloth. Spaniards, exploring down the Amazon, met with hostile, seemingly primitive natives, vast forests, and little prospect of farming. Only recently have more advanced cultures and ecosystems been discovered, indicating considerable diversity and progress. They built earthworks for raised fields, water channels, and fish ponds. An important crop was manioc, which was easily grown and a flexible food. The indigenous peoples proved to be creative, resilient, with cultures different from Eurasian counterparts. Perhaps the most amazing stories are the inventive genius of the foods they created. Next time on Food History and Mystery.